Good afternoon. My name's Diego.
And my name is Auri.
On today's Dog Talk episode, we'll be talking about U.S. attitudes and policies towards immigration. Today, we are also going to answer the questions: how is the system flawed and unethical?
How do laws lead to the exploitation of immigrants?
And finally, to what extent does foreign and domestic policy change for immigration and economic gain? Our conversation was inspired by Jeff Parker's cartoon from 2005 that illustrates the Statue of Liberty, saying, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddling masses yearning to work for nearly free." And the migrants looking at the Statue of Liberty and reading, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddling masses yearning to work for nearly free." The migrants then respond at that message by saying they left out the part that reads, "and then go back." Our question being, what specifically does this mean? What do you think it means, Audi?
I think that what the cartoon is kind of saying is that we target these specific people. We target people that are unwealthy and from developing countries, specifically Latin America. And we know since they're unwealthy, they'll work, like the cartoon says, for nearly free, right? So they're only seen as disposable labor.
To add on to what you said about them only being seen as disposable labor, they're only really used to, whenever they need. After they're done, they're gone for good. It's like how the migrants responded by saying they left the part out where we go back. They tell them, "Oh, we're going to give you benefits, everything you need," but they always leave out the part that we need to go back. And I'll hand it back off to you, Adi.
Yeah, so they're unwealthy, so they're easy to be exploited, right? And that's kind of the big issue at hand here. And like George W. Bush said in his 2004 speech about foreign policy and immigration policy. Second, new immigration laws should serve the economic needs of our country. If an American employer is offering a job that American citizens aren't willing to take, we ought to welcome into our country a person who will fill that job. Yeah, he acknowledges the need for labor if no one really wants that job that is in the U.S. currently. So it is kind of the migrants' right to be able to take that job. It's just the problem is they're often exploited,
I think what he kind of means by that is he acknowledges that there's a need for labor, and that if no one's there, no American citizen wants to take it, specifically an agricultural job, which most people know are really harsh jobs, and most of them don't pay as well.
Yeah.
I think he wants to acknowledge that migrant workers from anywhere, specifically Latin America and stuff like that, are willing to take up that job and step up to the mantle needed to require and fill in those jobs that no one else would. And I think he kind of acknowledges it by saying if no other American wants to fill that job, why should we stop someone that should from another country that wants to fill in that job for our economic gain? And what I think my take about it is he acknowledges that need for it, but he also acknowledges it's for economic gain. It's not just for the people. It's more of that economic gain.
That's true. So oftentimes employers take advantage of migrants and may hire migrants rather than domestic citizens, and then they exploit them because they're not always endowed the same rights as a U.S. citizen, right? So they're seen as less, even though the U.S. is kind of telling them and to come and fill in that job, to come and fill in that void. So it kind of answers the question, how is this system flawed and unethical?
Well, I think the system's more unethical because it allows for the exploitation of people that the country is required, it's needed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they just don't address it because they know they can exploit the people. And it goes back to what Jeff Parker did a year later.
Exactly. So it's kind of flawed on purpose, because at the end of the day, if it's flawed, it's easy to exploit people. Yeah. So we get more economic gain.
Yeah.
And that all kind of starts with World War II.
Yeah, the Bracero. So if you didn't know what the Bracero program is basically during World War II specifically, there was a shortage of labor.
Yeah, we were rationing food.
And this was because, first of all the white citizens and African Americans were going off to war. And since there was no one to fill in the factories, women stepped up stepped up and started taking in those jobs in the factory. But with all the people going to the war, this also left a gap in the agricultural business. And during this time, there was Japanese internment, which were one of the main groups that were in the fields. And due to this, like all the farmers during this time had like no workers, so there was a rationing, like Audi said earlier. And this led to the United States and Mexico coming to an agreement, which they would bring in Mexican laborers and they would pay them. They promised benefits like housing,
things like a livable wage. But then sometimes what ended up happening is that they would surcharge them for their homes they were living in. So it kind of canceled out, and were often working in bad working conditions, like in the hot sun, right? And just among the pesticides and all of that, sometimes without bathroom breaks. And
this kind of goes into something more recent, which is basically, just to summarize it, is the act which issued more of a illegal immigrants penalties on employers who knowingly hired the workers without proper documentation. So basically anyone who just hired the workers and knew that they were like undocumented, didn't have any like legal work, they could get penalized thousands of dollars and stuff like that. But it also allowed for any residential like immigrants, which are still like illegal, but they've been living there for a long enough time, they would be allowed to become legalized, as well as any undocumented agricultural workers. And that allowed for around 3.2.
So you kind of see them encouraging migration, but then also 10 years later, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, pushed by Bill Clinton, basically made crimes more deportable. So you were more likely to get deported. So it doubled the number of deportations during that time.
And before this time, usually you wouldn't see that many deportations of these immigrant laborers that were needed. It was mostly unless they committed like a large crime, so like theft, murder, and all that. That's when you would see deportation and incarceration. And that's when you start seeing, after this law that Audi was talking about that comes in, that's when you start seeing the more deportation. That level starts rising up and you start seeing more of it. It kind of doubles as a result of this.
So yeah, then it's harder to come in and then stay in the U.S., right? Because if you come, you're more likely to get deported. And by making it harder to be here legally, they kind of had a backwards effect, and more migrants began to come, and more migrants began to come to the U.S. illegally, right? So
this led to more like exploitation of those people.
Exactly.
And this made it so like any like worker like organization could take advantage of it, specifically child laborers, since they were the most vulnerable, as like some of them would have their parents deported and then the kid would stay here. And then there's companies such as
so in an Upfront magazine titled Child Labor in America, quote, in LA, children stitch Made in America tags into J. Crew shirts. They bake dinner rolls sold at Walmart and Target, processed milk used in Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and deboned chicken sold at Whole Foods. So they're exploited by these large companies, right? Which was something that the Immigration Reform and Control Act was supposed to control, right? Yet the government kind of turns a blind eye to it when it's an economic benefit for the U.S. companies, and just, overall a benefit for the U.S. It doesn't matter if they're exploiting these children that are working in bad working conditions, right?
Yeah, and then this kind of answers our question about how the system was unethical, because the system kind of set this box, like a small box, and the people would find a way to like exploit it, and that box had like, if you think about it like as a box, it kind of just had a bunch of holes in it that allowed for loop arounds, and it just led to more exploitation and bad use of it. And then there's people that would stand up to this movement, such as Cesar Chavez.
Yeah, so since the U.S. didn't do enough to control like the companies and stuff, so that comes from like the civil rights of Cesar Chavez fighting for workers' rights, and overall they want better rights because they're exploited, they don't get enough pay, and are just in terrible work conditions, which is what Cesar Chavez and other figures have fought for, not only Latinos, but African Americans and Native Americans, women too, especially after World War II, where you see a lot of these civil rights movements. And yet, there's still lots of racism around, because
there's still a lot of this.
See this pattern?
And then this discrimination is, seen in today, such as, the DeSantis, what he's doing right now. It's not only harming the immigrants, it's harming the local economy of Florida. And it's doing this by, kicking out all those hard workers that were working on the farms. And a fun fact, if you didn't know this, is that around 90% of all vegetables and fruits on the Daily American's plate are actually from undocumented workers. And what DeSantis is basically doing is he's stripping these farmers who've dedicated their lives to, their craft of just, farming. They've gone, multiple farming generations. Is basically he's just destroying that by taking away their labor force, which are mostly from Central America, and making it harder and scaring them.
Yeah, and he's making it harder basically for an illegal immigrant to work, even though time and time again that's what the U.S. has wanted the migrants to do, right? Our primary quote, George W. Bush, saying that if a migrant wants to take a job, he should. Yet they're kind of doing the opposite right now at the moment.
Yeah.
They're basically fear-mongering, They say that migrants are stealing work, and then people like DeSantis just basically strip away migrants the right to work.
And this just kind of shows how there's discrimination today, as DeSantis is just pushing for this form. And people are agreeing with him, not knowing that we need migrant workers for our society to live as a whole, because they provide most of our labor work and they fill in most jobs. As this one farmer in Florida says, that if farmers wanted to get an average American citizen to work, they would have to raise their price wages up to $22 an hour. And this kind of causes a problem for the farmers, since most of the American workers that they would hire usually want to quit either on the first day or want to go home after lunch.
Yeah. And, we always have been a country of migrants, You kind of see this recurrent pattern of nativism and racism. For example, Donald Trump promised that he would make it illegal for any illegal immigrants' children to be a U.S. citizen, which would take a whole amendment to pass, and that just wouldn't pass. He's just doing it to fearmonger and to try and garner support from lots of
discriminative people
exactly
in the country that are still today. And this kind of shifts into our more question about how, to what extent does foreign and domestic policy change for migration and economic gain? And I think what the domestic and foreign policies change to for the economic gain and for the use of migration is they only really change when we need them. So when we need economic
support,
support or something that we desperately need, we call for it and then just call them off. And it kind of goes back to what Jeff Parker's immigrants that he drew. What the message that they're relaying is that they always leave out the part that says go back. And it's just kind of we only call upon them when they're needed, no other time. And we just change our foreign and domestic policies to either be oh yes, we'll allow all this immigration, but we'll exploit them at the same time. But we kind of make this false treaty that we'll treat them right just to lure them in, kind of give them a pull factor. And then after that, we're going to just be stricter laws, make it harder for them to do whatever they want, harder everything. And that kind of shapes the domestic and foreign policies under that category of immigrants are only needed for economic gain and support.
Yeah. And you see that pattern a lot. Women also during World War II, after the war ended, they kind of were encouraged to go back at home and just be stay-at-home wives. And kind of the same with African Americans after the war, they're kind of seen just to go back. And you know, like it is reoccurring in U.S. history. So I do think that like it does change often, and like Diego said, migration is encouraged mostly for when it's economic gain at the end of the day. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode of Dog Talk, follow us at IHS Dog Talks and leave a comment if you have a question. Thank you for listening.